I never thought I'd get this call during an economics lecture. The sudden vibration of the phone seemed to split the silence of my world, and I shuddered, instinctively clenching my fingers on the ballpoint pen I had just used to make notes in my notebook. When I looked at the screen and saw my mom's name, a cold lump of anxiety slid down my spine. Dad. He had been fighting pancreatic cancer for several months, and although the doctors had not given me any false hopes, I still stubbornly believed that this day had not yet arrived. I felt my chest constrict, and the air in the auditorium suddenly became heavy, unbearable. Awkwardly apologizing to the professor, I got up from my seat and hurriedly went out into the hallway, clutching the phone with trembling fingers. Mom? My voice trailed off as I pressed the phone to my ear. Emily, my mom's voice faltered, and I barely heard her next words, uttered in a barely audible, broken whisper. Your father is gone. Everything around him, the walls of the university, the students passing by, even the faint noise of conversations outside the classroom door, suddenly lost its meaning. I stood clutching my phone and felt something crumble inside of me. I thought I was ready for this moment. We talked about it, and I spent the last few weeks with him, knowing that the end was inevitable. But nothing could have prepared me for this void into which I suddenly fell. I've always been a daddy's daughter. Memories surged through me, crashing against each other like waves during a storm. He taught me how to ride a bike, patiently running beside me until I stopped falling. He helped me with math, although he hated algebra, but he always smiled when he saw how my eyes lit up when I finally understood the solution. He was the one who took me on college tours, discussed the pros and cons of different universities with me, and then proudly squeezed my hand when I received my acceptance letter. Mom was different. She never stayed at one job, switching between hobbies, projects, and social activities all the time, but it never bothered her. Dad loved her for that. He provided for his family by working as a financial advisor, never complained, even when he had to deal with endless bills and expense plans. I ran my hand over my face, trying to control the lump in my throat, and asked, Are you okay, Mom? I don't know. Her voice sounded distant, almost empty. Emily, I'm scared. This confession made me shake up. I wanted to scream, cry, and go back to my childhood, when Dad was strong, Mom was cheerful, and the world was stable. But that was no longer the case. Now there was only reality. I had to go home. I took off, not thinking about missing the remaining pairs, and when I got to the dorm, I hurriedly threw a few things into my bag. The only thing that was spinning in my head was the need to be there. When I got to the train station, found the first available train, and finally settled into my compartment, time seemed to slow down. Endless landscapes flashed by outside the window, but I didn't see them. Memories of the last months surfaced before my eyes. Dad was methodical even in his illness. He patiently told me what paperwork needed to be done, how to manage finances, and how to support my mother. He often told me, You're strong, Emily, you can handle it. And I just nodded, not wanting to believe that this moment would ever come. The house greeted me with a silence that made me uneasy. I saw my mother at the entrance, disheveled, in a crumpled designer blouse, with black streaks from mascara under her eyes. When I got closer, she threw herself into my arms, sobbing. Oh, Emily. Her voice was shaking. What am I supposed to do in this house now? All these accounts. I haven't worked in 20 years. I tightened my grip on her, feeling how fragile her body was shaking in my arms. Mom, let's focus on the funeral for now. Did the Pope leave any instructions? She sobbed and waved her hand vaguely in the direction of her father's office. He had everything there. He was always so organized. I noticed a half-empty glass of wine on the counter and felt something uncomfortably constrict inside. The next few days merged into one continuous blur. I organized funerals, coordinated work with a funeral agency, and called relatives while my mother mostly cried or drank to calm her nerves. The morning of the funeral was clear and crisp. The house was filled with people, friends, colleagues, distant relatives. I accepted condolences, having a hard time coping with the feeling that all this was not happening to me. Mom made a real show of crying dramatically several times during the service. I noticed her friend Sandra leaning over to whisper something to her, after which Mom nodded sharply. I didn't know what exactly she said to her, but for some reason, I had a bad feeling. I smiled discreetly as people came up to me one by one, shaking hands, hugging, saying the usual words of comfort that didn't seem to make the slightest sense. "Your father was a wonderful man," they said over and over again, as if that could somehow ease my pain, as if I didn't know that better than anyone else. "He always thought ahead, always took care of his family," they said, and I just nodded, controlling myself, because I knew Dad wouldn't want me to fall apart. He raised me strong, taught me to keep my back straight and face difficulties with dignity. But even all his guidance, all his love and support could not prepare me for what it would be like to stand by a fresh grave, watch as a coffin with a man who was everything to me was lowered into the ground, and realize that never again would I hear his voice, see his smile, or I'll feel his warm hand in mine. When the ground began to settle, when people began to disperse, when silence slowly but inexorably covered the cemetery, I couldn't help but wonder what changes our lives were going to face now, what decisions I had to make, what I would have to deal with alone. A week has passed, filled with chaos and fuss, paperwork, closing accounts, endless phone calls from relatives, sympathetic but detached. And then the day came when Mom and I had to go to Mr. Peterson's law office to read the will. I sat in the chair opposite his desk, trying to look calm, but feeling my shoulders tense from the unconscious expectation of something that I still had to realize. Mom sat next to him, her fingers nervously fidgeting with a pearl necklace, a gift from Dad for their 20th anniversary. She didn't speak, but I could feel her tension. I could feel it in the way she trembled slightly, as her fingernail tapped on the wooden surface of the table. Mr. Peterson, an elderly man with penetrating eyes and a voice that sounded even and clear, adjusted his glasses and began to read the will. "Being of sound mind and firm memory, I, Robert James Harrison, declare this to be my last will and testament." I listened attentively, but the real tension came when he moved on to the distribution of property. "To my beloved daughter Emily Harrison, I leave our family home along with the sum of $200,000. I heard my mother's head snap up, and I felt the space between us tighten, as if the air had suddenly become heavier. "To my wife Catherine Harrison, I leave a monthly allowance of $1,500, which will be paid from my pension fund." There was a silence filled with tension that could be cut with a knife. "Is that all?" Mom's voice was broken, shocked, and she stared at Mr. Peterson as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "I'm his wife. 23 years of marriage. And that's what I get?" Mr. Peterson's tone remained consistently gentle but firm. "Your husband has carefully considered these arrangements. The will is duly executed and has legal force. It's best to accept his decision." I looked at my mom. Her fingers were clutching the pearl necklace so tightly that I was afraid it was about to break. She muttered something under her breath, but I couldn't make out the words. The drive home was stressful, filled with her snappy comments about the injustice, how she couldn't believe it, how Dad would never do that, that there must have been some mistake. I was silent. I had nothing to say. That evening, I cooked dinner, Dad's favorite pasta recipe. I wanted us to get back to something familiar for at least a moment, but Mom didn't touch the food, just moved it around the plate, and then looked up at me. "Emily, I just don't understand." Her voice was shaking. "Why did your father leave you everything? House, money. What should I do now? Where should I go?" I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently but firmly. "Mom, you don't have to go anywhere," I said softly. "You can stay and look after the house while I'm at college. It will benefit both of us." Her entire expression changed. The tension disappeared, her fingers loosened, and she squeezed my hand back. Tears welled up in her eyes, but now they were tears of relief. "You're the best daughter in the world. I knew you wouldn't let me down." A few days later, I returned to college, taking care of the automatic payments for utility bills and property taxes from the account that my father left me. My mom and I started talking on Skype regularly, and it seemed like she was getting better. She told me about the art courses she had enrolled in to cope with her grief, talked about new acquaintances and plans. But as the weeks turned into months, something began to change. Our calls were getting rarer, and Mom was texting more often instead of getting in touch. When we did talk, the conversations were short, interrupted by phrases like, "Sorry, honey, I have to run," or "I'll call you later." I told myself that it was good that she was busy, that maybe this was her way of coping with the loss, that she had a new life. But somewhere in the depths of my soul there was a feeling of anxiety, faint, barely perceptible, but which I could not get rid of. December arrived with snow dust, clear cold air, and the promise of Christmas, which was felt in every garland, in every twinkling light, in every smell of cinnamon, spread through the streets. I've always loved this month, when the world seemed to freeze in anticipation of something bright, but this time, instead of the usual excitement, I felt only anxiety. Mom's calls became shorter and shorter, and her voice became more distant, and at some point I realized that I hadn't heard her laugh in a long time. It was then that I came up with the idea to surprise her, to come home for the holidays earlier than she expected, to spend Christmas with her, as we always did as a family. The train ride turned out to be a long one, but thoughts of childhood, of old Christmases, of how my dad and I took out boxes of toys and decorated the house filled me with warmth. I remembered how he would put presents under the tree, and then whisper to me conspiratorially, "I wonder who this mysterious Santa is?" And I wanted to believe that if I came home, if I saw my mother, if we put candles on the table together, then at least for a moment everything would be the same as before. I took a taxi from the train station, watching the familiar streets flash by the windows. The houses were decorated with lights, decorated Christmas trees could be seen in the windows, people hurried with packages of gifts. The world continued to move, not stopping at our loss, and I suddenly felt hurt that for someone it was just another Christmas, while for us it was supposed to be the first without Dad. When I arrived at the house, there was a warm light in the windows, and smoke was coming from the chimney, which means that the fireplace was lit. I felt the key in my pocket and, trying not to make any noise, quietly opened the front door, imagining how surprised my mother would be when she saw me. The house smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and I felt relieved at least something remained unchanged. But as soon as I took a step inside, I heard laughter. A feminine, light, joyful voice, my mother's voice, which I hadn't heard for so long, and a man's voice. I froze, tensing, and then cautiously approached the living room. When I stopped in the doorway, my heart thumped in my chest. Mom was sitting on the couch, leaning forward slightly, her palm resting in the hand of a man I'd never seen before. He looked younger than her, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, with a carelessly tied scarf and a slightly bohemian look. They were sitting so close that they seemed like a natural extension of each other, laughing at something that was known only to them, and, apparently, they felt completely comfortable together. My presence destroyed this cozy picture. "Emily?" Mom jumped slightly, her smile faded for a moment, and then she hurriedly added, I wasn't expecting you." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed over my chest, still trying to process what I'd seen. "I thought I'd surprise you for Christmas," I said flatly, carefully watching her reaction. "You know, we always spend it together. Like a family." An awkward silence filled the room. The man got up from the couch, and I noticed that he was wearing Daddy's slippers. "Dear," Mom's voice suddenly became unnaturally high, almost apologetic. "I'd like you to meet James." She hesitated, looking from me to him, then swallowed and added, "My husband." I must have misheard. I'm sorry, did you say husband? I stared at her, waiting for an explanation I couldn't imagine. Like in marriage? Mom nodded. Yes, dear. We met at my art class. Do you remember when I told you about him? James is also an artist. She spoke in that explanatory childish voice of hers, the one that always drove me crazy when she was trying to soften the unpleasant news. 3 months ago, she continued, but I was already counting in my head. Dad died 7 months ago. 8, Mom corrected quickly, as if she could read my mind. Emily, dear, when you find love again, you will understand. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to distract you from your studies. You were so busy in college. I slowly looked around, and only now did I really see how much the house had changed. Dad's favorite armchair was gone, replaced by something modern that didn't match the rest of the furniture at all. There were new paintings on the walls, bright, messy splashes of color that my mother would have hated 6 months ago. And on the mantelpiece, where there used to be family photos, there was now a large wedding photo of Mom and this James. Something cold spread in my chest. You moved him to my house. The words escaped before I could stop them. Without asking me. Mom's face tightened. Emily, she said sharply. This is my house too, you said that yourself, right? I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together, remembering how Dad always kept his cool in difficult situations. Well, I think we should get to know each other better. James, who do you work for? He smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Oh, do you know how things are these days? The economy, the labor market. I felt anxiety rising inside me. He spoke easily, casually, as if we were old friends, and with every word he spoke, my mother seemed to immerse herself more and more into their cozy world, understandable only to the two of them. James was talking about his latest exhibition, which, according to him, caused intense emotions among the gallery visitors, and then, smoothly moving from one to the other, he laughed, recalling a funny incident involving his mother's drawing technique, and she suddenly giggled, throwing her head back, like a teenager hearing a compliment for the first time. I tried again. But where do you work now? His smile faltered slightly, but he quickly pulled himself together, leaned back on the sofa and spread his hands, as if this question was too simple for a man like him. Well, I'm between jobs right now, he said, making a vague gesture with his hand. I'm looking for a suitable opportunity, something that really meets my creative spirit. Mom intervened before I could say a word. Her voice was a little sharper than she probably intended. He's an artist, Emily. He doesn't need a 9-to-5 corporate job. It would kill his creativity. I nodded, but before I could speak again, James, as if sensing a threat, hurried to add. My previous boss just couldn't understand my vision. Some people are too conservative to appreciate real art. I didn't answer. There was no point in talking anymore. The next morning, Christmas morning, I woke up to the loud clink of plates and muffled voices downstairs. For a few seconds, I just lay in bed, listening. Then, feeling anxiety building in her chest, she went downstairs, following the noise. In the kitchen, Mom was busy at the table, arranging our best porcelain set on it, the one that Dad had given her for their 20th anniversary. I remembered her saying that it was too expensive for frequent use, that it was special and meant only for the most significant moments. But now she was not only arranging it, but also covering a lot more places than we usually did at Christmas. Are we expecting guests? I asked, taking a mug out of the cupboard and filling it with coffee. Mom nodded slightly, not looking up from her work. Oh, yes, James' family is coming for Christmas dinner. They're such nice people, Emily, you'll see. I froze, clutching the warm mug in my hands. What about the Andersons? I looked at her, hoping she'd just forgotten to mention them. Dad's sister Sarah, her family? Uncle Mike and Aunt Jenny? Her hands hovered over the cutlery for a moment, and when she finally looked up at me, they had the same expression as last night, a mixture of caution and annoyance. Emily, it's different now. I need to get along with James' family. They're a part of our lives now. I opened my mouth to protest, but at that moment the doorbell rang. Oh, they're already here. Mom exclaimed with joy in her voice and hurried into the hall, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the ghosts of all the Christmases I've ever known. James's family arrived in a noisy crowd, as if breaking into our house, filling it with their voices, laughter, and endless conversations. His parents are a hard-eyed man and a perfectly coiffed woman who appraisingly surveyed the living room. His sister Rachel with her husband and 2 children, who immediately rushed around the house, looking at everything around, as if they had already decided which room was which. I watched it from the shadows, feeling like a guest in my own home. During dinner, Mom continued to cast worried glances at me, but did not interfere when the conversation turned completely to James' family. His father complained about property taxes, his mother angrily discussed turkey recipes and suggested the best options. His sister told him which schools were trending now and which areas were considered the most promising. I sat in silence, moving the food around the plate, and thought about how Dad used to sit in this place, how he poured wine for everyone, how he told funny stories about his childhood, how he looked at Mom with such warmth that my heart sank. You know, Rachel said suddenly, putting down her fork and smiling broadly, this house is in such an ideal location, right next to a good school. Kids could go to a great school district. And so much extra space. She looked around, as if already mentally arranging the furniture. Oh, that would be wonderful. She continued. Mom explained that we would like you to be with us, James added with a smile, but his eyes remained cold. Isn't that right, Emily? And at that moment, something inside me clicked. All the tension I've been accumulating over the last few days, all the frustration, all the resentment, it all spilled out. Actually, no, we wouldn't, I said evenly but firmly, feeling an oppressive silence fall in the room. Rachel blinked, as if she didn't understand what had happened. Excuse me? I looked right at her. This is my house. Dad left it to me, not Mom, and certainly not to strangers who want to move in and occupy it. Rachel fell silent, her face went blotchy, and her husband muttered something under his breath about ungrateful young people these days. James' parents looked at each other, and his mother pursed her lips in disapproval and clicked her tongue. But I barely heard them. I only looked at my mom. And she was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of embarrassment and anger. And something else. Something that felt like hate. James' family didn't stay long after my outburst. Rachel, pressing her lips into a thin line, imperiously lifted her chin, grabbed the children by the hands and headed for the exit, hissing through her teeth. We are clearly not welcome here. The children started crying, but she didn't even try to calm them down, just irritably tugged at the cuffs of her blouse and added, giving me a contemptuous look. In any case, I would not like to live in this house. The accent with which she pronounced this house sounded almost like a curse, as if she was talking about something dirty, untouchable, not worth her attention. As soon as the door closed behind them, Mom exploded. How could you? Her voice was shaking with anger, and she whirled on me, her face flushed. Do you have any idea what you've done? I was silent, waiting, giving her a chance to speak, but indignation was already bubbling inside me. This is my new family, Emily, she continued, waving her arms around the empty space as if trying to prove something obvious to me. No, Mom, I tried to speak calmly, the way Dad taught me, but there was a cold hardness in every word. They're James's family, and they were planning to take over my house as if it already belonged to them. Your house? Mom laughed bitterly, but there was no humor in it. This was our family home long before your father decided to play favorites in his will. I gripped the edge of the table with my fingers to keep the harsh words from coming out. I did the right thing, I said flatly. And if you don't see it, then maybe Dad was right about everything. After these words, an icy silence reigned in the room. The rest of my holiday visit passed in sullen silence. Mom and James disappeared into their room whenever I was around, as if my presence was now not only unwelcome, but unbearable. I tried to spend as much time away from home as possible, visiting my father's family, and when I told Aunt Sarah that she hadn't even been invited to Christmas dinner, she sobbed and shook her head. Robert would be heartbroken, Uncle Mike said softly, putting his hand on my shoulder. I returned to college hoping that the distance would help me heal, that maybe time would dull the pain, that I would be able to focus on my studies and put all this family drama behind me. I was wrong. Mom started calling again, but now those calls were different. She hardly asked about my studies, about my life. Instead, every conversation invariably turned to the same topic, money. James and I are fighting, Emily, she said one day, her voice plaintive. The monthly allowance barely covers anything these days. We need help. I clutched the phone in my hand, a dull rage rising in my chest. Mom, maybe it's time for both of you to look for work. I suggested carefully, trying not to make my voice harsh. There was a tense pause on the line. How dare you, she hissed at last, and I barely recognized her voice. I'm your mother. I raised you. And now you're acting like some kind of cruel, heartless stranger. The call ended with a sharp click. An hour later, my phone vibrated and I saw a message. A photo of an empty refrigerator. Underneath it is a short but dramatic message. When we starve to death, it will be on your conscience. I stared at the screen for a long time, remembering how Mom used similar tricks when she wanted something from Dad. He used to give up, saying it was easier than fighting. He knew she was manipulating him, but he still gave in. And I found myself doing the same thing. I transfer money from my father's account to her account. It's become a habit. Her dramatic please. My reluctant translations. Her temporary gratitude. New requirements. The following months passed in this cycle. I was living in college, trying to focus on my studies, while my mom and James were living in my house, and I was actually providing for them. They never visited me, they never came to campus, they weren't interested in my progress. When graduation time came, I was waiting for them to at least come to the graduation ceremony. They didn't arrive. We sent a message. Sorry, dear, we have an important art exhibition today. We are so proud of you. I sat with the phone in my hands, feeling something inside me finally break. I knew why they hadn't come. Because I stopped sending money a month before. I'm tired of providing for their lifestyle. I'm tired of this endless dependence, endless manipulation, and the feeling that I'm not a daughter, but a purse. So I decided to return home. When I called my mom and told her about my plans, her reaction was sluggish. Oh, you're moving, she said quietly. Her voice was flat, almost indifferent. And then she added, well, I guess this is your house. The way she singled out your house made me remember the same tone Rachel used to say it. It was like it wasn't our home anymore. As if I was superfluous. I expected indignation, anger, and accusations from her, but instead, for a moment, something like surprise flashed in her eyes as if she didn't believe that I really dared to refuse her. She blinked, then slowly straightened up, folded her arms across her chest, and pressed her lips into a thin line before speaking again. Emily, she said flatly, but with that cold tone that always made me feel guilty, even when I wasn't doing anything wrong. You're being completely unreasonable. I started to reply, but she continued without letting me get in a word. You live in this house, use its facilities, eat at this table, and considering how much James and I spend on maintaining this place, it would make sense if you contributed your fair share. I felt a wave of indignation wash over me. Have you done your fair share? I repeated, slowly clenching my hands into fists. Mom, I'm already paying all the bills. Electricity, water, taxes, groceries. Which you consider your own, she interrupted me with a sharpness that resembled a lashing blow. You buy food and, you see, hide it from your family so that you can eat alone. You pay for gas and light and complain that the house is too warm when we have guests. Because your guests are James's family, not mine, I blurted out, no longer holding back. And because you're not even trying to earn anything yourself. She narrowed her eyes. We're creative people, Emily. You're unemployed people, Mom. She inhaled sharply, as if I had hit her. You've always been ungrateful, she hissed. I do not know who you have taken after. I laughed, bitterly, briefly. Dad, obviously, I said. A second of silence. Her face contorted, and I knew I'd hit the mark. Get out of my kitchen, she said in an icy voice. I looked at her lips pressed into a thin line, at her tense shoulders. The woman who once hugged me, who braided my hair in the morning, who read me fairy tales before going to bed, now stood in front of me like a stranger, demanding my entire salary from me, as if I owed her something. This is not your kitchen, Mom, I said softly but firmly. This is my house. I turned around and walked out, leaving her standing there, panting with anger. Something changed after that conversation. She didn't try to talk about money directly again, but her attitude towards me became icy. If before she had at least pretended to care, pretended that she wanted to spend time with me, now she just ignored me. James has changed too. He no longer tried to be friendly, nor did he tell endless stories about the cruelty of the art world. Now, when I entered the living room, he just looked at me with an expression of mild contempt, then defiantly turned around and left, as if my company was unbearable for him. James's family continued to come to the house, but now their visits were accompanied by barely noticeable sarcastic comments about me. It's so sweet of you to let your mother live here, James' mother said one day, pouring herself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd bought. Not every daughter would be so generous. Yeah, not everyone, Rachel agreed, giggling. I was silent. But everything was boiling inside me. The turning point came 2 months later. I returned home late at night after a long day at work, intending to just have dinner and go to bed, but when I opened the door, I immediately realized that there was a party in the house again. Music, laughter, the smell of alcohol. I walked into the living room and froze. There were people everywhere. James's relatives, his friends, some strangers. They were sitting on the couch, on the floor, on kitchen chairs, drinking wine, eating. I looked around the room and felt something crackling inside me. Dad's table was littered with dirty glasses. There were paintings on the walls that hadn't been there before. Dad's old armchair, the armchair in which he loved to read in the evenings, has disappeared altogether. And then I saw James. He was sitting in Dad's favorite spot by the fireplace, lounging with a glass in his hand, and laughing at something Rachel had said to him. Mom was sitting next to me, smiling, as if it was completely normal. I took a step forward, barely able to keep my hands from shaking. What's going on here? Silence. Everyone turned to me. James raised an eyebrow and grinned. A party, dear. You don't mind, do you? Mom looked at me, and I saw a challenge in her eyes. She knew what she was doing. She knew I wouldn't like it. But she did it anyway. I took a deep breath, straightened up, and looked right at her. Everyone out. The room froze. Emily, don't be dramatic, Mom began, but I interrupted her. Out. James grinned and slowly set the glass down on the table. And if we don't leave? I met his eyes. Then I'll call the police. There was a tense silence. And then, slowly, as if testing my limits, James got to his feet. "Don't overreact," he said, his voice low and oily. I didn't look away. "You're right," I said calmly. "It's not worth it. So let's just settle this. You're all coming out of my house." James looked at his mom. She didn't say a word. But her eyes were flashing. One by one, people began to stand up, some muttering to themselves, some whispering to each other. They left slowly, reluctantly, with unhappy faces. Mom and James were the last ones left. She stood up, her hands shaking with rage. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed. I looked at her and no longer saw the woman who had once been my mother. "Maybe," I said. "But that's my mistake, not yours." She looked at me for another second, then abruptly turned around and left, slamming the door. I was left standing in an empty, ruined house full of memories, but for the first time in a long time I felt like I was breathing. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and listened to their play going on downstairs, James's whisper, Mom's muffled sobs, the clatter of dishes, perhaps carelessly thrown into the sink. They seemed to go through all the stages of grief, from anger and rage to humility and attempts to negotiate. I didn't come down. When the knock on the door sounded a few hours later, I already knew that I would hear her voice. "Emily, honey," Mom said in a sweet, sugary voice, the same tone she always used to get her way. "Can we talk?" I took a deep breath before answering. "About what?" Well, her voice faltered, but I knew it wasn't from sincere emotion. "I think we've all gone a little overboard. It was a misunderstanding." I was silent. "Honey, we're a family," she continued, and there was a slight creak outside the door. She was probably leaning against the jamb, feigning sad disappointment. "And families don't kick each other out on the street." I closed my eyes. "Families don't use each other," I said flatly. There was a pause. "I don't understand why you're being so cruel to me, Emily." I sat up in bed, staring at the door. "Cruel? Because I don't want to pay for your parties? Because I don't agree to give my salary to you and your husband, who basically doesn't work?" Silence. Because I want to live in my own house without feeling like an outsider? I heard her exhale noisily. "You're getting it all wrong, honey. I'm tired." So much so that there wasn't even anger left inside me, just emptiness and a distinct realization. This wasn't the woman who kissed my forehead when I fell asleep, or the one who held my hand before my first day at school, or the one who laughed at Dad's jokes until he got sick. I got up and went to the door. "You wanted to talk?" I asked. "Yes," she said hopefully. I turned the lock and opened the door. Mom was standing in front of me, her eyes red from crying, but she quickly swallowed and tried to smile as if everything was fine. James loomed over her shoulder, arms crossed over his chest, with an expression of mild disdain. I was looking at them, and I suddenly felt really funny. They really thought they could beat me. "Tell me," I said. Mom took a step forward, but I didn't back down, and she had to freeze right in front of me. "Listen," she began, trying to look contrite. "I understand that you're upset. We're all tired. Let's just take a step back and try to solve everything." "You mean start living off me again?" Her face twitched. "It's not fair," she exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "I'm your mother." "So what?" She was taken aback. "How? How can you say that? I raised you." "And now I'm an adult," I said calmly. "And you're an adult too. Two grown women. And for some reason, one of them believes that she has the right to live at the expense of the other." Mom opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "I've given you a week to move out. That's generous. Emily. You don't live in the house that belongs to me anymore." She turned pale. "You can't do this to me." I cocked my head to the side. I can't. My words hung in the air, heavy as a stone. You won't do that, she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. I'll do it. Silence. James chuckled. Great, he said. But you know we're going to need time. We don't have much money for rent. I smiled at him. Not my problem. He narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. You have 7 days, I repeated. Mom didn't move, her shoulders were shaking slightly. Dad wouldn't do that, she finally whispered. I was startled. But she didn't give up. Dad has allowed you to manipulate him for too long. She sighed, and her hands dropped to her sides. You're going to regret this, Emily. I shrugged my shoulders. Maybe. And I closed the door in front of her. The following days passed in tense silence. I came home from work and saw my mom and James dragging boxes, packing their things, and trying to talk to me over and over again, first calmly, then with accusations, then with threats. I didn't react. They tried to stay longer, but on the last day I warned them that if their things weren't here by evening, I would call the police. The house was empty in the evening. I was standing in the living room, breathing in the air, which suddenly became somehow different, clean, fresh, belonging only to me. I looked around. Dad's chair was gone. But his table remained. I walked over to him, ran my fingers over the warm wood, and closed my eyes. Dad would be proud. I opened the door and stood motionless, meeting the gaze of my mother, who was brushing off excess makeup, straightening a sweater, the one she wore when she was trying to persuade Dad to buy her another expensive thing. She always knew how to create the illusion of lightness, as if her words weren't filled with requests, manipulations, and secret demands, but I knew her too well not to see the truth behind that mask. I was just joking about the money, she said, trying to laugh so that the sound didn't sound like crying. We don't need your salary, James, and I just want to continue living here with you. We're family after all. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't want to be weak. I didn't want her words to make me doubt what I'd done again. No, Mom, I replied, sounding tired like never before. I've made a decision. You need to find your own place, I added, almost not believing what I was saying, but knowing that I had no other choice. As always, she decided to address all her manipulations. Tearful notes, requests from James, photos of empty cupboards, unpaid bills, but I didn't give in. These pictures, these words, these old techniques, all this was already familiar, like an autumn rain that drips monotonously, without bringing anything new. I stopped eating at the table with them, ordering takeout and going up to my room, which I didn't leave except for work. The voices from downstairs, interspersed between arguments and discussions about my next steps, became the backdrop for a new reality that I was plunging into every day. A week later, as promised, I returned home and found that they had started packing their things. Mom theatrically threw clothes into boxes, and every sound of objects falling into cardboard boxes, as it seemed to me, was her last cry of despair. I hope you're happy, she spat, looking at me with an expression like I'd really robbed her of everything. You kicked your own mother out on the street. James stood behind her, arms folded, with the same endless expression of displeasure that so often occupied his face. What a daughter you turned out to be, he muttered, as if accidentally throwing another stone into my garden. I didn't answer. They left that evening, not without a final barrage of curses, slamming doors, and their car disappeared into the night. The house is finally mine. I walked through the rooms, as if filling them with my presence, my air, feeling the emptiness disappear, replaced by a new meaning. Everything was for me now. I've taken away what I don't need, leaving only those things that are dear to me. I could feel at home here, as I should have. A few weeks later, the news started coming from the family grapevine. Aunt Sarah called me and said that Mom was complaining to everyone who would listen to her, that I had kicked her out of anger, that her life was now ruined, But strangely enough, no one took her side. The family remembered how she treated Dad, how she manipulated him to the last, and no one believed her new tears. Uncle Mike told me that Mom and James tried to move in with Rachel, the same sister who had once said she would take my house for Christmas, but Rachel refused them, and it seemed to me that this was one of the sweetest victories. James, as always, was out of work, repeating his old excuse that he was too creative for a normal job, while his mother got a job as a salesman at a local boutique, receiving a salary that was only enough to rent a small apartment on the other side of the city. One day I ran into my mom at the grocery store. She looked completely different, without makeup, without expensive creams, without those caring procedures that used to make her radiant but empty. She saw me and immediately turned her cart in the opposite direction, as if I were something contagious. I felt strangely relieved. This was not the man who once made me doubt myself. A few months later, when I had already managed to let go of everything that had happened, I felt that I was ready for a change. It wasn't just a repair, it was a restoration. That weekend, I bought paint samples and gardening tools to start redoing a house that had witnessed so much drama and pain. The house, which had seen all the suffering and manipulation, now had to become something new. I finally realized that sometimes you have to destroy something to build something much stronger.